During the early 1980s, the DDR had nearly eliminated HD from their breeding stock. This video tells about the data and methods that they used to achieve such a remarkable feat. I will attach the documents and data to the end of this video for you to review. 7. Controlling HD. Please consult the index for the term HD. This disease of the hip joint has been affecting the breeding of German Shepherds for 30 years now and is still a major concern today. This disease has always been diagnosed in humans and is said to be one of the most common congenital deformities in humans. Hippocrates, an important doctor of antiquity, around 460 to 377 BCE, described this condition. Hip dysplasia, HD, in dogs was first diagnosed in 1935 in America by Dr. Schneller, chief physician of an animal hospital. At the end of the 1960s, a major wave of discussion on this topic began. Veterinarians wrote about hip dysplasia in all specialist journals, and these articles contributed greatly to educating breeders and dog sports enthusiasts. The causes of HD in dogs have been more or less speculated about in all specialist articles. A very interesting statement in this context is made by Professor Dr. Schlaf in an article about HD in the magazine Der Hund. He writes, "If size, body structure, position and movement develop disproportionately in any direction, which is not always visible at first glance, this can contribute to the emergence or worsening of certain defects. By unconsciously selecting unsuitable breeding options, we ourselves have contributed to the spread of the disease." These are statements that should give us food for thought. Schlaf goes on to say that the question of the hereditary nature of the disease is the most interesting for dog breeders. This has been debated for years. In an article on combating HD, Dr. M. Scheffler explains that now, 1968, all research agrees that HD is a hereditary defect whose inheritance is still unclear. Skeletal measurements, and HD falls into this category, have a heritability of 50 to 80%. This provides opportunities for breeding selection. The higher the heritability of a characteristic, the greater the possibility of using selection methods to influence a change for the better in this characteristic. In further explanations, Scheffler refers to Henriksson, Sweden, who was the first to carry out an estimate of the heritability of HD. The leg position and movement of 610 German Shepherds were assessed, and only then was an X-ray taken. The aim was to determine whether and to what extent an experienced assessor could suspect HD. The suspicion was particularly significant when the hocks rotated outwards, or when the limbs were unsteady and poorly coordinated. In these cases, HD was almost always present. Breeders should pay particular attention to this fact. In his studies, Henriksson estimated the heritability at around 60%. All authors mentioned and those who published later, Dr. Tignor in the magazine Der Hund, came to the unanimous conclusion that HD is a hereditary disease, or that we now know with certainty that HD is hereditary. So something was happening in terms of combating HD. In Germany, the SV was the first to take the initiative. However, a letter from the USA had previously arrived at the SV, which was also published in an SV newspaper. It stated that many German Shepherds imported from Germany were affected by HD, and that in future, only dogs that had been X-rayed would be imported, and the X-ray image would be provided. This demand was also answered in an SV newspaper by Dr. Funk, then first chairman of the SV. He rejected this demand from the USA with rather harsh words, and replied that Germany was, after all, the motherland of the breed, and the SV therefore did not have to rely on foreign authorities to dictate whether or not to have its dogs X-rayed. However, development continued, and progress prevailed. After that, there were a number of very interesting and informative articles about HD in the SV newspapers of the 1960s. In the annual report for 1964, Dr. Funk wrote that we, the SV, are of the opinion that the X-ray question is far from clear. But the demand that we must rely on the naked eye instead of X-rays was quite remarkable. And we must be prepared to eliminate dogs that are weak in the hindquarters and wobbly in the hindquarters. The assessment of wobbly hindquarters requires a high degree of observation from the judge. In the next section of the annual report, Dr. Funk contrasts dogs with exaggeratedly angulated hindquarters with dogs with a taut, firm back and normal hindquarters. He then writes about the gait test. Foreigners often think that the gait is the only decisive factor. That is not the case. We want a powerful, enduring gait without showing the exaggerated angulation in the hindquarters. Some judges make the mistake of not looking at their notes on the standing judgment during the gait test and therefore only allowing the gait to be decisive. That is not correct. I prefer a normal gait with a good anatomical structure to a fleeing gait with a less good structure. The statements about the wobbly hindquarters and the exaggeratedly angled hindquarters, as well as the normal hindquarters in connection with a powerful, enduring gait, have a direct connection to the HD problem. In a summary of the most important resolutions and decisions of the meetings of the board, the breeding committee, the training committee, and the advisory board held on April 9th, 10th, and 11th, 1965, it says, concerning breeding, on the subject of hip dysplasia. As the hereditary nature of hip dysplasia cannot be ruled out, an attempt should be made to use X-ray examinations at a veterinary college, which the owner of a dog can arrange voluntarily, to identify dogs found to be free of hip dysplasia in the breeding certificate and breeding book, by noting A after the breeding class 1 or 2. The owners of dogs that have been registered are allowed to submit the hip joint findings to the breeding office within a period yet to be set. A very interesting and informative article about hip dysplasia by Dr. Ferd appeared in the SV newspaper number 7 of 1965. He states right at the beginning that it is a congenital malformation and that the tendency towards a delayed development of the hip joint socket and femoral head is inherited. Depending on the severity of the malformation, stress can lead to a more or less severe displacement of the head outwards and upwards, to subluxation, and in the case of severe dysplasia, to complete luxation, dislocation. In Dr. Sachs's further comments, he says that experts today, 1965, no longer need proof that X-rays are the best and only reliable method of detecting hip dysplasia. He then quotes Dr. Snavely, USA, whose statistical data show that dysplastic parents predominantly produce dysplastic puppies, while normal parents predominantly have offspring with normal hips. Dr. Sachs advises breeders who want a constructive program to reduce hip dysplasia. Snavely recommends that only parents with normal hips should be used for breeding. Incidentally, Dr. Snavely criticizes the fact that too many certificates are issued by veterinarians about normal hips. In order to ensure that the examination technique and assessment of the X-ray findings are as uniform as possible, Dr. Sachs suggests that initially only the 4 veterinary clinics at the universities of Berlin, Hanover, Gießen, and Munich, and a few veterinarians should be authorized to carry out the relevant X-ray examinations. When it comes to the fact that when HD is inherited, Dr. Sachs assumes that there are probably secondary genes in the genetic material in addition to a main gene. If these secondary genes are missing in 1 or more generations, these offspring are apparently healthy, but pass on the abnormal, mutated main gene, and visible hip dysplasia only occurs when the main gene and secondary gene meet again in a generation. It is therefore not uncommon for dysplastic parents to have children with normal hips, and vice versa. These processes make assessment difficult and make eradication difficult. Dr. Sachs then cites a number of authors from the medical and veterinary fields as well as the results of breeding experiments and then summarizes: 1. Hip dysplasia in dogs is hereditary. 2. There is a dominant inheritance pattern with incomplete penetrance, power. Dr. Sachs also points out the commercially advantageous side of HD-free breeding. Quote, all Nordic countries are only allowed to import dogs that are free of hip dysplasia. In the USA, X-rays are required for breeding and exhibition animals imported from Germany. The American Army and police are not allowed to employ dysplastic dogs. Switzerland is starting to take the hip dysplasia problem seriously. Dr. Sachs's demand. For all these reasons, I believe it is necessary for the SV to give up its previous reservation and issue breeding regulations to combat hip dysplasia. When asked how hip dysplasia should be combated, Dr. Sachs comes to the conclusion: what we can and must do is to gradually eradicate hip dysplasia through suitable breeding measures. The summary of his article then states, in order to gradually eliminate hip dysplasia from breeding, the breeding committee has decided that from 1966 onwards, the dogs that are radiologically free of hip dysplasia will be marked during the breeding inspection. If male dogs free of hip dysplasia are mated with female dogs that have normal hip joints, you quickly get hip dysplasia-free strains. If male dogs with normal hips are mated with bitches with milder degrees of dysplasia, you can gradually get hip dysplasia-free offspring through displacement crossbreeding. The extensive discussion and the numerous publications about HD were of course also important for the dog breeders in the DDR, and led to measures. The SV's initiatives also became known, although we only got hold of an SV newspaper sporadically and very rarely. The DDR followed suit in terms of timing. On November 9, 1967, an active conference of the Specialist Section for Small Animal Diseases took place. 4 veterinarians and 3 representatives of the SDG Presidium took part. It was stated that HD is a hereditary disease, that consistent treatment is necessary, and that the complete exclusion of dogs suffering from HD from breeding must be the future goal of all special breeding associations. There was also resistance in the DDR, including in the management of the SCG German Shepherd dogs, to immediate measures to combat HD, in other words, to mandatory and extensive X-ray examinations of dogs. However, the progressive opinions that were the only correct ones for breeding prevailed. It took until January 1, 1969, before mandatory X-ray examinations for HD were introduced, which meant that all male and female dogs that were to be used for breeding had to show evidence of the X-ray findings in order to take part in the ZTP or grading. As early as 1968, due to the extensive discussions about HD, due to the recommendation of the SZG German Shepherd dogs, and also due to the open interest of our breeders and members, a large number of dogs were X-rayed. Before I go into the results, a little about the classification of the various HD grades. The 15 district veterinary clinics of the DDR were authorized to carry out the X-ray examinations. All images were sent to the Humboldt University in Berlin, where Professor Dr. Schlaf carried out the evaluation centrally for the DDR. At the beginning, there was a classification of degrees. 1. HD free. On the report card sent to the dog owner, there was the text, "No indication of the presence of hip dysplasia." This finding corresponds to today's normal. 2nd borderline case. This finding corresponds to today's almost normal. 3. Mild HD. This finding is identical to today's still approved. 4. Moderate HD 5. Severe HD. The second finding, borderline case, was only reported for a shorter period of time, probably just under 2 years. Then this group of findings was no longer reported separately, and since it was only a very slight physiological deviation, this group was counted among the HD-free and also designated as such. So we then had the 4 groups of findings: HD-free, mild, moderate, and severe HD. A very important and successful measure was the connection of each HD finding with the dog's name. The 4 groups of findings mentioned were represented by the small letters A, Taba HD-free, B, mild HD, C, moderate HD, and D, severe HD. These small letters were placed with a hyphen in front of the dog's name and were a mandatory part of the stud book name of every dog that was X-rayed. These HD letters from the name appeared accordingly in the pedigrees, in the breeding certificate, on the ZTP certificate, in show catalogues, in judges' reports in the specialist magazine, in the mating and breeding news, and wherever a dog's name was printed. In this way, every male and female dog was marked with its HD status for the breeders and members, and the most frequently used male dogs were soon known by heart. The breeders and members, including puppy buyers, focused on HD-free dogs, and so we were able to include the majority of breeders in the selection of the breed. Examples of the connection between HD findings and the names of the dogs: A. Fred vom Falkenbruch, B. Kassa vom Sachsenblut, C. Argo vom Williamsklause, D. Gundo vom Stolperland. Our results: German Shepherds only. In 1968, the year in which X-ray examinations were still voluntary, 1,933 dogs were X-rayed. Of these, 1,077 were HD-free, 55.7%. This number already includes the borderline cases, almost normal. 322 dogs had mild HD, 16.7%. 279 dogs had moderate HD, 14.4%. And 255 dogs had severe HD, 13.2%. In the first year of the mandatory X-ray examination in 1969, 3,453 dogs were X-rayed. Of these, 2,238 dogs were free of HD, 64.8%. 490 had mild HD, 14.2%. 454 had moderate HD, 13.2%. And 271 had severe HD, 7.8%. Before the results for all years of HD X-rays are presented in a table, a word about the selection measures, in other words, the consequences that the HD findings had for breeding. In a special circular from the SCG management dated August 11, 1968, it said, 1. From January 1, 1969, the X-ray results must be presented for all dogs presented for the ZTP or grading. 2. All dogs that already have the ZTP or grading must be X-rayed by June 30, 1969. The HD findings, the pedigree, the grading certificate, or the ZTP certificate must be sent in for processing. 3. Dogs with severe HD are immediately excluded from breeding. The owners of such dogs that had had the ZTP or grading up to that point had to send in the ZTP certificates or grading certificates. 4th, owners of bitches who want to have their dogs mated abroad may only use dogs that can be proven to be HD-free. All other HD grades, including those with moderate HD, remained in breeding. However, they only remained for a period of 3 years. On January 1, 1972, all dogs and bitches with moderate HD were excluded from breeding. The breeding permits and breeding certificates were declared invalid. So, from 1972 onwards, dogs with mild HD remained in breeding. They were allowed to remain in breeding for another 6 years. In Circular No. 1/1978, a restriction was initially announced for these dogs. From 1 January 1978 onwards, dogs with mild HD will no longer be licensed, but will still receive the ZTP. At shows, they can no longer receive a V, but can still receive SG. This transitional regulation remained in force for 1 year. Then, from 1 January 1979 onwards, they too were finally excluded from breeding and had to be rated M, unsatisfactory, at shows. Since 1979, breeding has only been carried out with HD-free dogs. As mentioned above, this includes dogs with the borderline diagnosis, corresponds to almost normal. These selection measures by the SCG management paid off, as shown in the table on page 149. The figures given all come from the HD examinations by Professor Dr. Schlaf, Humboldt University Berlin, who carried out the evaluation of all X-rays centrally for the entire DDR. The table shows a continuous increase in HD-free dogs in the first half, and at the same time confirms the correctness and effectiveness of the selection measures. By eliminating dogs with moderate and mild HD from breeding in 1971 and 1979, but also by marking the HD status with every dog's name, so that the breeders were included in the selection and focused on HD-free dogs, there was this clear increase after the effectiveness of the displacement crossbreeding. However, and this will be the case with every trait that is selected for, the curve of the increase flattens out as you get closer to the ideal. We had our best situation in 1985, with 94.4% HD-free dogs. After that, from 1986 onwards, there was a slight decline. It is very difficult to give exact reasons for this. Is it the effect of secondary genes that were mentioned in the article by Dr. Sachs quoted above? Is the constant striving for perfection of the build and exterior in the sense of absolute beauty partly to blame? In this context, I would like to remind you of the statements by Professor Schlaf, which were quoted at the beginning of this chapter. If size, body structure, position, and movement develop disproportionately in any direction, which is not always visible at first glance, then, etc. Thirdly, individual father dogs can also have a negative influence if they are used extensively in breeding. For example, D. Gundo vom Stolperland, SZ number 954339, had been X-rayed privately before the official HD X-rays began, severe HD. He was used extensively because he produced beautiful dogs, as this was not officially known. His son, the 3-time DDR winner A. Greif vom Felsenstein, he is said to have been HD-free, only passed on 27% HD-free dogs in his entire offspring. Gundo and Greif founded and dominated the A bloodline. Their genes, and secondary genes, were thus carried over many generations. Fourthly, there was another special cause in the DDR. Our West blood fanatics, we were all admirers of the beautiful West German dogs in the pictures in the SV newspapers, wanted West German stud dogs for their bitches. And since they were allowed to travel to West Germany, which was reserved for a few retirees, invalids, or those who were somehow privileged, these breeders used West German dogs that were in Czechoslovakia or Poland. The HD results in the Federal Republic were not as good as ours in the respective comparison year, as can be read in the SV's annual reports. Moreover, dogs with mild HD are still being bred in the SV today. Thus, the Czech and Polish dogs of West German breeding, although certainly not the best were sold there, could well have contributed to the deterioration of the HD results. Finally, there is one more thought when looking for the causes. Since the deterioration from 1988 onwards was 1989, the year of German reunification, was quite significant, it can be assumed that in the last quarter of 1989, when freedom of travel was now in place, there was a rush on West German male dogs. Did this also contribute to the deterioration? I am happy to admit that there are no clear reasons for the deterioration from 1986 to 1989. All 5 reasons mentioned here, and possibly others, probably worked together. The HD inheritance of all male dogs was published every quarter in the Specialist Journal and also in the SZG circular. Since there were no preliminary X-rays in the DDR before 12 months, all of the male dog's offspring that were X-rayed were recorded. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like these.